What would you do if the love of your life came with a price? When Daniel, a self-made entrepreneur, is rejected by his wealthy fiancé's family, he faces the ultimate choice: abandon his past for power or stand by the brother who raised him. But what happens when the truth about his identity leaves them all in tears? Stay tuned for a story of love, betrayal, and a revelation that changes everything. The grand estate of the Kensingtons stretched across acres of pristine land, its towering gates gleaming under the golden afternoon sun. Rows of perfectly manicured hedges lined the marble driveway, leading to a mansion so opulent it seemed plucked from a royal dream. The scent of blooming gardenias filled the air, mingling with the faint aroma of freshly brewed espresso wafting from the estate's open terrace. Inside, the grand hall shimmered under the light of an enormous crystal chandelier, its glow casting intricate patterns across the mahogany floors. The murmur of refined conversations, punctuated by the occasional clink of fine china, filled the space as the distinguished guests of the Kensingtons indulged in their extravagant afternoon gathering. At the center of it all sat Victoria Kensington, the beloved only daughter of the influential Kensington family. Dressed in an elegant white gown embroidered with delicate pearls, she exuded an air of effortless grace. With piercing blue eyes and golden locks cascading over her shoulders, she looked every bit the heiress that high society revered. But behind her poised smile, her heart wrestled with uncertainty. Today was the day she would introduce her fiancé, Daniel Carter, to her family, and she feared their reaction. Daniel, a humble and reserved man, stood at the entrance, adjusting the cuffs of his modest blazer. The moment he stepped onto the estate, the butlers exchanged wary glances, the guests raised their brows, and whispers rippled through the gathering. "Who is he?" someone murmured. "Certainly not one of us," another scoffed. Victoria clutched his hand tightly, her heart pounding. Would they accept him? Or would their prejudice drive them apart? Little did they know, Daniel's true identity would soon leave them in stunned silence. The air inside the Grand Kensington estate grew thick with quiet judgment as Daniel Carter stepped onto the marble floors. His sharp brown eyes scanned the room, taking in the gilded chandeliers, the towering oil portraits of past Kensington patriarchs, and the rows of elegantly dressed guests sipping imported champagne. Yet, despite the luxury surrounding him, it was the air of superiority that weighed the heaviest. Victoria's father, William Kensington, an imposing man in his late 50s with a salt and pepper beard and a calculating gaze, studied Daniel with a smirk barely concealed behind his crystal glass. Her mother, Eleanor, sat beside him, her lips pursed as if she had just tasted something bitter. "Victoria, darling," Eleanor spoke first, her voice silky but firm. "You didn't tell us you were bringing a guest." Daniel, sensing the tension, extended his hand. "Daniel Carter, it's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. and Mrs. Kensington." William barely glanced at Daniel's outstretched hand before taking another sip of his champagne. The silence that followed was suffocating. Just as Victoria opened her mouth to defend him, the doors to the grand hall swung open, and a butler rushed in, his usually stoic face etched with distress. "Sir, there's a man outside, he's causing a scene." A murmur spread through the guests. William's brow furrowed. "Who?" The butler hesitated. "A beggar, sir. He's asking for Mr. Carter." Daniel's body stiffened. Victoria turned to him, confused. "Do you know him?" Without answering, Daniel strode toward the entrance, the whispers of the guests trailing behind him. Victoria followed closely, heart pounding. Outside on the Grand Kensington driveway stood a frail man in ragged clothes. His face was worn, his hands trembling. The scent of the city, of sweat, desperation, and exhaustion, clung to him like a second skin. His eyes, sunken but burning with recognition, locked onto Daniel. "Danny," the man rasped, his voice raw. "It's you." Victoria's stomach twisted. She had never heard anyone call Daniel that before. He had always been composed, in control. But now, standing in front of this man, his entire demeanor shifted. His shoulders tensed, his jaw clenched. Daniel took a step closer. "James?" His voice wavered. What are you doing here?" The man, James, let out a shaky breath. "I had nowhere else to go. I looked for you. His voice cracked, emotion overwhelming him. I need help. Behind them, the guests had gathered by the doorway, their murmurs growing louder. How does he know that man? Is he some long-lost relative? This is humiliating for Victoria. Eleanor's sharp voice cut through the air. Victoria, who exactly is this Daniel Carter? Victoria turned to Daniel, waiting for an answer. But he was lost in the moment, his eyes locked onto James, his hands clenched into fists. James took a step forward, voice desperate. You're the only one who can help me, Danny. Please. And in that moment, Daniel felt something crack inside him. He had spent years burying his past, erasing the name Danny from his life, rising above the struggles he had once known. But here was James, a ghost from the life he had tried so hard to leave behind, forcing him to face it once more. The weight of the Kensington's judgment bore down on him. He could see it in their eyes, their silent verdict. But what mattered now wasn't their approval. It was the man standing before him, the past he had once turned away from, demanding to be acknowledged. Daniel took a deep breath and did something that made the entire room gasp. He stepped forward and pulled James into an embrace. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Eleanor's hand flew to her chest. William's jaw tightened. Victoria's eyes widened, searching Daniel's face for answers. But he had none. Only a decision to make. Would he protect the life he had built, or finally confront the truth of who he was? A stunned silence stretched across the grand Kensington estate as Daniel held James in a firm embrace. The once opulent atmosphere, where glasses clinked and laughter had danced through the air, now felt suffocating, thick with judgment. Daniel could feel James trembling in his arms. The man's breath came in uneven gasps, his frail frame barely holding together. Years of hardship were carved into his sunken cheeks, his tattered clothing an unmistakable mark of his struggle. Victoria stepped forward hesitantly. Daniel, she whispered, her voice laced with confusion. Who is he? Daniel slowly pulled away from James, his hands still gripping the man's shoulders as if grounding himself. He turned to Victoria, his expression unreadable. He's my brother. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Murmurs erupted, hushed voices dripping with disbelief. His brother? A Kensington marrying into that? This is disgraceful. Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line. William set his champagne glass down with a decisive clink, his sharp gaze locked onto Daniel. You have a brother, he said slowly, his tone carrying the weight of an interrogation. Daniel inhaled sharply, feeling the walls of his past closing in. Yes, he admitted. I do. Eleanor scoffed. And yet, you failed to mention this before. Daniel's fingers curled into fists. Because I knew exactly how you'd react. James cleared his throat, his voice raspy. I don't mean to cause trouble, sir, he said, looking between the powerful family before him. I had nowhere else to go. His eyes flickered to Daniel, raw and pleading. I didn't know if you'd even want to see me. Victoria looked at Daniel, searching his face. Why didn't you ever tell me? Daniel exhaled, rubbing his temples. Because I spent my entire life trying to be someone they would accept. He gestured toward the crowd, the Kensingtons, their high society guests, their judgmental stares. And I knew that if they saw where I came from, they never would. Victoria's heart clenched. She had always known there were parts of Daniel's past he kept locked away, but she never imagined something like this. William stood, buttoning his suit jacket with deliberate precision. His eyes, cold as steel, landed on Daniel. Then tell us, Mr. Carter, he said smoothly, though his voice carried a sharp edge. Where exactly do you come from? Daniel's jaw tightened. He could feel their expectations pressing against him, waiting for him to stumble, to fail. But James, unaware of the invisible war raging in Daniel's mind, spoke first. We grew up in foster care, he admitted, his voice soft but firm. Bounced from home to home, never really having a family. Danny, he caught himself, correcting, Daniel, was always the smart one. He worked harder than anyone. He studied late at night when the rest of us were just trying to get by. He told me one day we'd have a different life. James swallowed, his voice thick with emotion. And he did it. He made it out. Daniel clenched his jaw. He hated hearing it laid out so plainly, hated the way it made him feel exposed. Victoria's chest tightened. The man she loved had carried this burden alone for so long. Eleanor, however, merely sighed, waving a dismissive hand. So, a tragic past. How sentimental. She turned to Victoria, her voice lowering. And this is the man you expect to marry? A flicker of defiance crossed Victoria's face. Yes, mother. He's the man I love. Eleanor's expression hardened. Darling, love is a fleeting emotion. Status, however, is eternal. A tense silence fell over them. William took a slow step forward, standing inches from Daniel. His presence was overpowering, demanding. Let's be clear, he said. The Kensington name carries weight, power, legacy. We cannot afford a stain. His gaze flickered to James, then back to Daniel. If you marry my daughter, you marry into a family that values excellence. His voice dropped lower, his words a dagger. Tell me, Daniel Carter, can you uphold that? Daniel's blood boiled. He had spent his entire life proving himself, rising above his past, excelling beyond what anyone expected of him. And still, it wasn't enough. But before he could respond, James spoke again. I think he already has. All eyes turned to him. James stood straighter now, something fierce and protective in his gaze. You all talk about legacy like it's something you're born into, he continued, his voice growing stronger. But legacy isn't money. It's not a name written on a building. It's the people we help, the lives we change. He looked at Daniel, pride shining in his tired eyes. Daniel built himself from nothing. He didn't have connections or wealth. He had grit. And despite everything, he never forgot who he was. That is the kind of man you should be proud to call family. A stunned hush fell over the room. Victoria's heart swelled. William's face remained unreadable, but Eleanor scoffed, shaking her head. Romantic nonsense. She turned to her husband. We need to put an end to this embarrassment. William studied Daniel for a long moment before delivering his verdict. If you walk away from her now, he said, I will make sure you never set foot in this world again. No business, no connections. You will be nothing. Daniel's stomach twisted, but he wasn't afraid. He had built himself from nothing before. He could do it again. Then William's gaze darkened. But if you stay, James does not. Daniel's breath caught. James froze. What? You will cut him out, William said simply. No contact. No support. You choose, my daughter, or your past. A heavy silence followed, thick with tension. Daniel's heart pounded. His mind raced. This was the test. The moment he had feared all his life. But as he looked at Victoria, at James, he knew one thing for certain. He would not let them decide his fate. And so, with steady resolve, Daniel lifted his chin, ready to answer. A tense silence choked the grand hall, thick with unspoken threats and judgmental stares. Daniel stood frozen, his pulse hammering in his ears as William Kensington's ultimatum settled over him like a noose. You choose, my daughter, or your past. James stiffened beside him, his breath hitching. Victoria's hand found Daniel's, her grip desperate, pleading. The weight of expectation pressed down on him, suffocating. He had fought his entire life to be seen as worthy, to escape the shadows of his past, to step into a world where people like William Kensington couldn't dictate his worth. But now, they were demanding the one thing he had sworn he would never do, abandon his brother. Daniel's gaze flickered to Victoria. The woman he loved. The future he wanted. But at what cost? The air in the room seemed to thin as William took another step forward, his voice a whisper but sharp as a blade. This is the way the world works, Daniel. The past is meant to be buried. He straightened, adjusting his cufflinks. You've done well for yourself. You have potential. But only if you let go of what holds you back. Daniel's fists clenched. His entire body tensed with the force of his fury. He had spent years proving himself, clawing his way up from nothing, excelling in business, making connections. And yet, In the eyes of men like William Kensington, it would never be enough. He would always be the boy from nowhere. The orphan. James' voice broke through the tension, low and resigned. It's okay, Danny. His lips barely moved, but the pain in his eyes was unmistakable. I knew this was a mistake. I shouldn't have come. Daniel's chest constricted. James was his brother. The only family he had ever truly known. They had spent nights huddled together in the cold, whispering about dreams of a better life, of a future where they wouldn't have to beg, steal, or fight just to survive. Daniel had sworn he would never turn his back on him. He turned to Victoria, searching her face. Her blue eyes shimmered with unshed tears. Daniel, what are you going to do? The answer was clear. It had always been clear. He exhaled slowly and lifted his chin. I'm making my choice. William's lips curled into a knowing smirk. Good. Daniel stepped forward. But instead of taking William's outstretched hand, he stopped just inches away, his dark eyes burning with something fierce, something unyielding. I choose my brother. The room gasped. Eleanor let out an incredulous laugh, shaking her head. Oh, how utterly foolish. But William's expression darkened. Do you understand what you're saying? Daniel's voice was steel. Perfectly. A stunned silence followed. Then William let out a slow, measured exhale. He stepped even closer, lowering his voice to a near growl. You will regret this. Daniel didn't flinch. Maybe. He turned to Victoria, his voice softer now. But I won't regret staying true to myself. Tears spilled over Victoria's lashes. Daniel? He cupped her face gently, brushing his thumb over her cheek. I love you, Victoria. But if you love me, really love me, you'll understand why I can't do this. Eleanor scoffed. Oh, darling, please. She'll find another. But Victoria shook her head violently. No, I don't want another. She grabbed Daniel's hands, her voice trembling. I love you. I don't care about any of this, William cut her off. Enough. His voice was final, deadly. He turned to Daniel, his expression now eerily calm. Then consider yourself exiled. You'll never work in this city again. Every door I opened for you? Every connection you've made? Gone. You are nothing without my approval. Daniel met his gaze without hesitation. I was nothing before I met you. And I survived just fine. William's smirk faltered. Daniel turned to James and placed a firm hand on his shoulder. Let's go. James blinked, as if struggling to process what just happened. Are you sure? Daniel nodded. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. Victoria's breath hitched. Wait. She turned to her father, her voice trembling with emotion but filled with resolve. If Daniel goes, I go. Eleanor gasped. Victoria, don't be ridiculous. I'm not. Victoria's voice hardened. If this family values status over love, then I don't want to be part of it. She turned to Daniel, eyes brimming with determination. I choose you. Daniel's heart clenched. Victoria. But before he could protest, she grabbed his hand, intertwining their fingers. I love you. And I won't let them control my life. William's composure finally cracked. If you walk out that door, you are no longer a Kensington. Victoria inhaled sharply, but didn't let go of Daniel's hand. Eleanor's voice rose in a desperate shriek. Victoria, think of your future. I am thinking about my future, Victoria shot back, her voice unwavering. And it's with Daniel. A heavy silence settled over the room. Then, slowly, Daniel smiled. A real, unguarded smile. Hand in hand, the three of them, Daniel, Victoria, and James, turned their backs on the Kensington Empire and walked toward the door. The whispers behind them were deafening. The disapproval clung to their backs like a heavy cloak. But as they stepped into the fresh night air, Daniel took a deep, liberating breath. For the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid. He wasn't running from his past. He wasn't chasing approval. He was simply free. Victoria squeezed his hand. What now? Daniel glanced at James, then at her. We build something better. And with that, they walked forward, into the unknown, but together. The cold night air wrapped around them as Daniel, Victoria, and James stepped away from the grand Kensington estate. Behind them, the laughter and murmurs of the elite carried through the massive iron gates, but none of it mattered anymore. The weight of expectation, of judgment, of a life Daniel had fought so hard to fit into, it was gone. But so was his safety net. As they reached the sidewalk, James exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. What? That was dramatic. Daniel let out a short laugh, rubbing his face. Yeah. Not exactly how I imagined tonight would go. Victoria turned to him, searching his face. Are you okay? He met her gaze, his chest tightening. I don't know. He let out a slow breath. I just lost everything I built. Victoria shook her head, stepping closer. No. You lost their approval. What you built, your intelligence, your resilience, your ambition, that's yours. No one can take that away. James nodded. She's right, you know. You didn't climb to the top because of the Kensingtons. You did it because you worked your ass off. Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. That might be true, but let's be real. I just made one of the most powerful men in the country my enemy. William meant what he said. He's going to make sure I never work in this industry again. Victoria's jaw tightened. Then we build something without him. Daniel glanced at her. And how do you suppose we do that? James smirked. We hustle. Like we always have. Daniel chuckled, shaking his head. You make it sound so easy. James shrugged. It won't be. But when has anything ever been easy for us? Victoria intertwined her fingers with Daniel's. We'll figure it out. Together. A comfortable silence fell between them. For the first time in hours, Daniel let himself breathe. Despite the uncertainty of their future, he had something far more valuable than money or status. He had loyalty. Still, the reality of the situation loomed over them. Daniel's bank accounts would likely be frozen by morning. His name would be smeared in high society circles. Investors would pull out of any deal he was involved in. He turned to Victoria. Are you sure you want to do this? If you go back now, your parents might still... She cut him off with a firm shake of her head. I don't want to go back. She took a deep breath. I spent my whole life being the perfect daughter. Following their rules. And for what? To be a pawn in their games? She squared her shoulders. No. I choose this. I choose you. Daniel swallowed the lump in his throat. He didn't deserve her. But he would spend every day proving himself worthy of her love. Just then, James clapped his hands together. All right, lovebirds. As touching as this is, we have bigger problems. He gestured to himself. For example, I have no money, no home, and about $2 to my name. Daniel smirked. Then it's a good thing I've got a little bit of cash stashed away. James raised an eyebrow. Oh, secret accounts. Daniel chuckled. Not exactly. Just emergency money. Enough to get us by for a few weeks. Victoria nodded. Then we use that time to figure out our next move. A gust of wind rushed past them, carrying away the last remnants of their old lives. Daniel looked up at the towering city skyline, feeling both the weight of uncertainty and the thrill of possibility. They had nothing, but they also had everything that mattered. And that was enough. 1 year later, the sun dipped low over the New York City skyline, casting a golden glow over the glass towers that stretched toward the heavens. Inside a modest but modern office, Daniel adjusted his cufflinks as he stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, surveying the bustling streets below. A soft knock at the door made him turn. Victoria stepped in, her radiant smile lighting up the room. We just closed the Anderson deal. Investors are on board. We did it. Daniel let out a breath of relief, a slow smile spreading across his face. We really did. James strolled in behind her, grinning. And we did it without the Kensingtons. It had been the hardest year of Daniel's life. True to his word, William Kensington had pulled every string to blacklist him. He lost every business connection overnight. No one would return his calls. They had to start from scratch, living in a tiny apartment, surviving on savings, and working long hours to rebuild. But they did rebuild. Daniel, Victoria, and James had pooled their talents and launched their own consulting firm, focusing on investments that uplifted people instead of exploiting them. It had been slow at first, but their reputation for integrity and innovation spread. The Anderson deal, their biggest one yet, solidified them as real players in the game. Daniel turned to Victoria, admiration shining in his eyes. "You stuck by me through everything." She stepped closer, placing a hand on his chest. "And I always will." James clapped Daniel on the shoulder. "I think this calls for a celebration." Daniel smirked. "Dinner's on me." James grinned. "Now you're talking." As they left the office, Daniel took one last look around. A year ago, he had nothing but his name and his principles. Now he had purpose. Outside, the city hummed with life. They walked together, a trio bound by struggle, sacrifice, and loyalty. Daniel took a deep breath. A year ago, he had been faced with a choice: wealth and status or love and integrity. He had chosen right. And in the end, he had gained more than he ever imagined. Daniel's story wasn't just about losing everything and rebuilding. It was about knowing your worth. The world often tells us that power and prestige define success, but real success is about who you are when everything is stripped away. What would you choose? Would you sacrifice your values for approval? Or would you stand firm even if it meant walking away? In the end, integrity, love, and resilience always win. And maybe, just maybe, the hardest choices lead to the greatest rewards.